thank you so much, Jason, for organizing this and having me being a part of it, which is quite honestly a little bit intimidating. I know that philosophers are often intimidating. There's really no good reason besides that it can sometimes be a little too much. I also want to give a shout out to Gerard Starr in the back. He read an earlier version of this paper, and at one point a long time ago he was one of my students, but now he's really a collaborator. So thank you, Gerard. So the title of this is "The Sounds of This Place: Forgotten and Lost Voices." So I live in San Francisco, which is right here. It's white on this map. But I'm going to talk about the Seattle region, and I'm going to talk about Richard Nelson, who lived up in Sitka, and one of his works, The Island Within, is actually a bunch of tales around Mount Edgecumbe and Crusoe Island. He never names the island in his book, actually, but that's where he had a lot of adventures. So that's in the upper regions of Cascadia. All right. Damn traffic. Why are all these people on the road? This is indeed increasingly Crowdifornia. Look at that. All these people alone in their car. I normally don't drive to work, but today I have to. Here I am, stuck in traffic, and against my better environmental sensibilities, I am the solitary occupant of this vehicle. Alone indeed, just like all these other people around me in their steel shells. I'm painfully reminded of the reality that I am complicit in this crime against the planet. I am Crowdifornia, the traffic, the pollution, the killing of species. I take a few deep breaths, trying to let go of the stress and frustration, trying to find some stillness and not getting upset with the fact that I'm surrounded by expensive machines used for the ridiculous purpose of transporting individuals to jobs that contribute to the further destruction of the earth. I'm trying to not get upset by the fact that the cost of each of these expensive cars could be used to get multiple homeless off the street permanently. Instead of trying some other meditative practices, I turn on the radio. Kurt Cobain sings. All right, so here we are now. Entertain us. He is one of the voices of my generation, representative of what became the grunge scene, my first association with Seattle, Cascadia. The release of this album, Nevermind, was to us alternative kids in Friesland, the Netherlands, the biggest event of 1991. We heard these songs over and over again, played them on our guitars and with our bands, danced to them over the next years, including my first years in college in Amsterdam. This was it. Past tense indeed. Listening to it again, I strangely failed to feel any kind of excitement beyond the initial excitement of hearing Nirvana, the band that is. The basic repetition of 3 or 4 chords, the annoying bass line, the repetitive drum, the lame lyrics, never mind indeed. So, is it my foul mood, or have I moved beyond the Generation X mindset that simply wanted to be entertained? Was this our collective practice of letting things go by dancing to these ridiculously simple songs? Our dancing was purposefully without any kind of sophistication, jumping around without making any eye contact. Without a doubt, we perceived it as an act of rebellion, as most kids do, of course. Other Seattle bands had perhaps more depth, both musically and in terms of their lyrics. They were equally rebellious. Hunger Strike of Temple of the Dog made me first realize that the USA was perhaps not entirely full of greedy, selfish people who feel entitled to drop bombs in Iraq, broadcast it on CNN, and give it the codename Desert Storm as if it's some kind of computer game. Of course, that was the other big event of 1991. As you might guess, I myself was not a typical Gen X teenager. I was politically engaged, reading anarchist literature, was a vegetarian at the age of 16, a registered conscientious objector when I turned 18, and so forth. Of course, Kurt Cobain was frustrated with how his music became popular in the way it did. The sarcasm of "here we are now, entertain us" was largely lost. He had lost his own voice, and I'm now also turning off his voice and tuning to a different station. So KALX, the UC Berkeley radio station, is playing an interesting instrumental piece, which you just heard a few seconds. It turns out to be the Museum of Lost Species, an album released in 2019 by the Berkeley musical group Thomas Kornacki. We are presumably listening to sounds representing lost species. Maya Lin, the artist who designed the Vietnam Memorial, likewise is creating an online memorial for species that are lost or on the verge of being lost, endangered. Her project is called What is Missing? Indeed, what is missing? What is lost? And what occurs here in the transformation of extinction into artistic expressions such as music, video, poetry, or electronic images? Are these expressions functioning as memories, a call to action, a connection to loss, a way to mourn or celebrate these species that will be gone forever? The irony, of course, is great. Sitting in California traffic, remembering the species that we are literally and figuratively driving into extinction, hearing the voices that are already lost, while not hearing any voices around us. I am here reminded of anthropologist and nature writer Richard Nelson, who did several projects on lost or forgotten voices, while living in the northern part of Cascadia, also known as Southeast Alaska. Nelson recorded voices of animals such as ravens, bears, whales, wolves, and salmon, as well as voices of the earth, including trees, winds, tides, rain, and ice. So I'll play a very brief excerpt from Encounters North. It's the website on which he and others have published tons of podcasts, and I'll just play very briefly little segments that's called Tide.
Hi, I'm Richard Nelson for Encounters, a program of observations, experiences, reflections on the world around us. Well, the sound we're hearing is a reminder that we live in the midst of unimaginably vast forces. Most of the time we're totally unaware of them, but occasionally they do let us know who's in charge.
So he climbed with he got with his boat to a rock that's in the middle of this huge tidal area, and you hear the tide. It's these ominous voices of the tide coming in, and he's in the midst of it. His recordings of the voices of the earth are astonishing. That sound of the raven, right? It's that's really used in all their episodes of Encounters. I actually tried to record it because I wasn't sure if I was going to be online, and one of my students caught me in trying to do this, and she said, "Well, why don't you just go outside and record a rave?" I was like, "No, there is a difference here between Nelson recording it and just going outside with your tape recorder." Nels, as his friends called him, once played a recording to my students and myself. He had made it in a cave full of ice. He said, "This is what the beginning of the earth must have sounded like." Listening to Nelson and his recordings, one indeed becomes aware that even before life, the earth was full of sounds, the voices of the earth. Volcanoes creating the atmosphere, islands and mountains, tectonic plates shifting, waters carving mountains, eroding coastlines, ice pushing across continents and receding again. The creation of the surface of the earth as we know it today must have been a noisy affair. Of course, the origin of the universe is also described with a word suggesting a loud event, a bang. In his written works, such as The Island Within, Nelson writes about forgotten voices, in particular those of animals and the earth. After a surf session in the frigid Alaskan waters on a remote island at the center of Nelson's work, he realizes how little he knows about water. He writes, "Perhaps there's too much difference between the human mind and the mind of water." Then he double guesses himself. Or perhaps I haven't watched long enough. I think of Koyukon elders, who have spent their lifetime studying every detail of their natural surroundings, and have combined this with the knowledge passed down from generations of elders before them. The more people experience the repetitions of events in nature, the more they see in them, and the more they know, but the more they know their limitations of their understanding. So it is the Koyukon and other Athabascan peoples with whom Nelson spent significant time who have formed his understanding of the natural world, as well as the limitations of his understanding. In many ways, the approach of Nelson and the Athabascan peoples is comparable to that of Zen Master Dogen in his Mountains and Waters Sutra. Dogen also attempts to listen to the mountains and waters in order to have the processes of the earth tell their story. As the sutra begins, "These mountains and waters of the present are the expression of the old Buddhas. Each, abiding in its own Dharma state, fulfills exhaustive virtues. Because they are the circumstances prior to the kalpa of emptiness, they are the life of the present. Because they are the self before the termination of any subtle sign, they are liberated in their actual occurrence." So these voices of the earth, the mountains and waters, are empty. That is, they're impermanent and without qualities, characteristics, or names besides the ones that we have given to them. Dogen's sutra is listening to the voices that are not our own, or that lie beyond ours. He expresses the voices of the mountains and waters in a way that anyone educated in Western traditions can quickly dismiss as obvious and blatant contradictions. The discussion of mountains leads us to a tautology that states that the mountains lack none of their proper virtues, followed by a contradictory concluding statement that does not follow any logic. Hence, they are constantly at rest and constantly walking. Then for waters, he lists a series of either obvious or obviously inaccurate qualities that water lacks. Water is neither strong nor weak, neither wet nor dry, neither moving nor still, neither cold nor hot, neither being nor non-being, neither delusion nor enlightenment. I, as a smart-ass philosopher, might dismiss Dogen here with the same pace a GOP janitor acquits their president. Perhaps then I should stop and engage with the text. As Okamura Roshi writes in his commentary on the Mountains and Waters Sutra after citing the opening paragraph of Dogen's text, I quote, "Do you understand this? Somehow, even though we don't understand it, it sounds beautiful, very poetic. We want to understand, and this thirst to understand is a desire. It stands in the way of our encountering the text." End of quote. So when I read the text in order to satisfy my ego, it is not unlike the experience of being stuck in traffic desiring to get to my destination without encountering the traffic, the chaos that we call civilization. I am not listening. Nelson learned to listen to the earth through his indigenous teachers. After Nelson nearly killed himself by walking onto ice without taking proper precautions, one of his Koyukon teachers told him, "Wow, you know a lot of things, but you're not very wise, huh?" It is over years of living with and carefully listening to different native peoples that Nelson became wise. In his ethnographic study and personal reflection, Make Prayers to the Raven, Nelson describes the Koyukon experience of a different reality in the natural world. As a white Western man, even while he was always close to nature, he experienced the world in a fundamentally different way than the Koyukon do. It is something he was ready for as an anthropologist, but he was entirely unprepared for it emotionally. He writes, "I was unready for the impact of living it." It is, he suggests, the result of our Western education as opposed to what the Koyukon observe. So he writes, "What we have learned to see, my Koyukon teachers have learned through their own traditions about dimensions in nature that I, as a Euro-American, had either not learned to perceive or had it been explicitly taught do not exist. End of quote. So the Koikan worldview is entirely based on change, and their economy is a matter of the moment, in which mobility is the essential tool, territorial freedom is the essential concept, and those are some of the words that Nelson used to describe their economy. More concretely, this means that sometimes food is found close to their villages, sometimes they need to travel vast distances. It also means that they need a strong ability to adapt. The Koikan cannot afford to try to master the land. They are constituents of the land. They do not confront, but yield to nature. And within that reality, I quote Nelson here, the flow of the land becomes also the flow of the mind. And the flow of the land becomes the flow of the mind. This idea of the flow of the mind that originates in the flow of the land is also at work in the island within Richard's novel. The wild island visited by Nelson throughout his book is within him, a part of him. So returning to California, my current island within, stagnant traffic is the flow of the land, while my mind is racing at 1,000 words per minute. I think about how this year, for the third fall in a row, my state was on fire. 200,000 people were evacuated. Electricity was shut off in areas with expected high winds. The utility company PG&E quickly became the scapegoat, so that the disaster was reduced to a management issue, not related to our collective failure to live well. It exemplifies how in our Western mindset, we explicitly regard any natural disaster as something that is unrelated to our own actions. In a time marked by climate chaos and named the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, the Sixth Great Extinction, and so forth, it's becoming painfully clear that there is something terribly wrong with our so-called scientific worldview. When wildfires are raging, hurricanes wipe out whole communities, sea levels are rising, storms appear in previously stormless regions, droughts and monsoons are becoming more extreme and widespread, and low-lying communities are slowly disappearing underwater. It is time to revisit our worldview. To change our worldview, we will need to return to the land and the forces and voices of the earth that created and keep creating the land. The west coast of the United States, as part of the Ring of Fire, has been largely formed through volcanoes. The island within describes Khrushchev, in the center of it is a big dormant volcano, Mount Edgecumbe. In places such as Cascadia, we find indigenous stories that present a worldview in which the forces of the earth, including volcanic forces, play a central role. So many of the stories of the Haida involve Zelarons. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that name, and I asked a bunch of people the last couple of days, but if anyone has a better way to pronounce it, please let me know. So Zelarons, she's a volcano woman or a mountain spirit. She's often associated with frogs, and the word Zelarons is also the Haida word for frog. Different versions tell stories of volcanic eruptions after frogs were thrown into a fire. One story relates to an eruption caused by a young man who had tortured a salmon by pushing a little rock into his back. As is often the case with indigenous stories, they tell us how to treat other creatures and respect all life. Beyond these morals, the stories of Zelarons also offer a perspective of the formation of the land. And Cameron describes, among other things, the formation of a well-known Cascadian island, which started with the coughing of the frog woman. This, I quote, caused the waves to splash. Some water went up her nose. She sneezed. It was a monstrous sneeze, and it shook Frog Woman awake. The edges of the large shelf were again crumbling and drifting away, only this time, because the sneeze had been greater than the first cough, which broke loose the small islands, the pieces floating away were smaller, and one of the pieces was so big it was almost a world unto itself, and is today called Vancouver Island. if you look here, of course, at the coastline, you see all these small islands as if they indeed floated away from the mainland, and then we have bigger islands, such as Vancouver Island, your home. The appearance, disappearance, and reappearance of land is personified then through the figure of frog woman, whose actions are not always deliberate, as opposed to the actions of the animals. Indigenous stories such as those of the Haida, and of course we are on the land of the Haida, personify the elements and provide a strong sense of agency to animals. Western scientists will acknowledge that all life is made possible by volcanoes. They've not only formed the land, and continue to do so, they've also formed the Earth's atmosphere. Gases such as hydrogen sulfide, methane, and carbon dioxide emitted from volcanoes have formed the atmosphere. These gases still waft out of tectonic rifts. My friend and a shared friend of quite a few of us here, Tim Freeman, who is a philosopher and ceramist, and he followed Nietzsche's advice to live on the edge of the volcano, in his case, Kilauea caldera at the Big Island of Hawaii. So during the 2018 eruption, he had to live through constant earthquakes that threatened to destroy him and his ceramic vessels, reminding him that volcanoes are not only nurturing creators, but also violent destroyers. On a human level, we have to live with the reality of a volcano, as we do with wildfires and hurricanes, while realizing that in both its destructive and creative aspects, we lack any kind of negotiating power. We better listen to the voices of the earth. We can understand the language of volcanoes to some degree. A volcano provides warnings before it erupts, and often humans can flee before a true catastrophe. As a storyteller, the narrative of the volcano includes different morals. The legends of the Haida, one might suggest, are only stories made up by humans. Now, as a person who grew up very far from active volcanoes, I tend to think that these stories are indeed created by humans. Yet, every single explanation of a volcano is a story made up by a human agent or multiple agents. Using measurements and the collection of data, using skills and criteria invented by humans, measures with instruments conceived and rationalized by scientists, it's all human construction. The holy grail of science, data, is also, of course, far from objective, as Simon Wecker showed. By simply carting around 99 smartphones on the quiet streets in Berlin, he created a virtual traffic jam on Google Maps. All right, so data is far from objective. You can do all kinds of things with it. What is lacking in our scientific stories is morality and warnings, such as those of the Haida, the Tlingit, or the Koyukon. Science fails to provide warnings against our worst inclinations, so that we ultimately fail to live with the forces of nature in such a way that those forces are not going to wipe us out. Part of the reason why I commute to San Francisco is because my partner and I want to live closer to a natural environment, especially while raising two kids, who of course love cities. We live just north of Mount Tamalpais, or simply Mount Tam, because no one knows how to pronounce Tamalpais. Mount Tam. We're surrounded by hiking opportunities. I'm thinking about such hiking opportunities on this gorgeous January day. Why am I here slowly crawling around Mount Tam in this vehicle in the midst of exhaust, asphalt, endless roads and cars? I could be on the mountain or sailing out on the bay. And so could all those bleary-eyed teenagers playing games behind their computers. Even on public transportation, no one is in the present moment. Once on the Golden Gate Bridge during my regular morning commute by bus, we were nearing the south tower of the bridge. I watched outside of the waters, and a whale breaches. Wow. After the whale again disappears underwater, I look around expecting to share some words on this amazing shared experience. None of them are there, paying attention only to their electronic gadgets, missing a whale breach. So what exactly am I whining about? I have a good job, good career, I'm married, my parents are still alive, my grandfather turned 97 today. I have 2 children. I'm healthy. I have good friends in different parts of the world. I travel to great places. I live in a beautiful place. I saw a whale breed. What right do I have to be upset about sitting in traffic while people are literally drowning while trying to make their way to a future that will be a lot less glamorous than mine? Children get separated from their parents at the border of this country. Public schools are failing in areas that do not matter because the people that live there do not matter. The great city of San Francisco, so incredibly wealthy, is also full of poverty. Homeless sleeping on the streets in makeshift tent camps. People in all kinds of jobs are not able to afford the rent. It's a city full of displacement, forcing people out, generating long commutes. California is the 5th great economy of the world, a significant player in this insanity driven by fossil fuels. Securing those fossil fuels is a U.S. national security priority that has destabilized regions across the world. It is all connected. My driving of this car, full with plastics and electronics, burning gas, polluting, people fleeing their homeland depleted of its natural resources, run by dictators put in place or emboldened by U.S. foreign policies and military interference, Kurt Cobain shooting himself in the head because no one listens. Dogen suggests ultimately that we are the mountains and that the mountains are us. Without mountains we would not be. Likewise, it is indeed the case that my actions, and even more our collective actions, do move mountains, or rather make them move. If we dare to actually listen to the sounds of the earth and the voices of indigenous people, we will recognize that our actions are not without consequences. Meanwhile, back in my car, I also have to recognize that this traffic jam, these cars, these horns, the concrete, the asphalt, steel, crowdifornia, it is all the mountains and waters without end. Cars sitting still in a world on the move. The vibration of cars and motorcycles combusting fossil fuels that were once alive. 2 cars ahead have hugged, steel against steel. Their drivers need a hug while body language tries to indicate otherwise. I pass plastic and glass spread out on the asphalt, reflecting sunlight. We are all together here in this moment that is fleeting, dissolving into movement. Thank you. All right. Any comments, questions, criticism, thoughts? Josh?
I was just reflecting on Nels and the quote you had from Nels that the flow of the land is the flow of the mind.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, it becomes the flow of the mind.
So
where we live, right, the ecosystem in which we live.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, if we live in a natural environment, right, we have to live with the seasons, with the land, the other animals that we share it with, and so forth. Of course, when we live in cities, we're surrounded by traffic. What does that do to the flow of our mind, right? We get used to it in one way or another. I mean, I obviously don't like sitting in traffic. I think you got that. But yeah, I was talking, maybe it was this morning while we were having breakfast. Some people actually do love their commute because it's, the hour that they're, not in the craziness of their family and screaming kids, and they're not yet at their job. So it's their moment of quietude.
Yeah.
Right? I haven't gotten there, but yeah.
I saw on a social media site somebody complaining about traffic, and one comment was, "You are not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic."
Yes. Yes.
So that's what you knew about Seattle, was the grunge, basically.
I was talking earlier. I could not have imagined how old was I? That was 1991. So I wasn't even 20. I was 17 or so. And I could not have imagined ever going to Seattle, less so as a philosopher, being here, talking briefly about the grunge scene. But yeah, that was big. in my
Go to the
time.
house where he committed the deed. It's on Lake Washington Boulevard. There's a park next door. People leave little notes. and stuff.
I didn't know that. I've never, seen him as a god or something like that. But yeah, I'd like to check that out.
There is actually a nice memorial in Aberdeen.
Okay.
There by the bridge where he used to hang out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are formational years in some way, where you're kind of breaking away from your parents and you rebel. It's an act of rebellion, right? So yeah, it still is important to me in some degree, even while I really dislike the music now. Actually, not all of it, but yeah, when I listen to Nirvana now, it's oh my God, this is horrible. And I understand that it's played a lot here in Seattle, right, on the radio. Yeah.
KNDD was a big radio station, especially during that era.
Yeah.
7.7.
Right. Thanks.
Your use of multimedia and sound, and then speaking about vibrations and the person who's collecting the lost sounds. Who was that again?
Richard Nelson.
Okay, thank you. So made me think so much of the poet C.A. Conrad, and in particular the book Eco-Deviant. Do you know that book?
No, I'm
So
gonna.
maybe people know CA, but they're doing work of thinking about the loss of vibration as we lose species, and the rise of the electric hum, and the effect of the diminution of analog animal vibrations of the call of the bird and the flap of the wing, and how this affects our cells as we become impoverished for this type of sound wave that's going through the air into our bodies. And CA is actually doing a series of rituals that can be quite simple, like only eat red food for a week, and then take notes for the poem, and then write a poem. They're all about finding a moment of focused attention. And one of the practices is they're going around to all the Walmarts in the US by car, and going into the Walmarts and lying down in the middle of Walmart. And, they've been interviewed on the amazing podcast Commonplace about how they've learned that certain formations of the body freak people out and other ones are okay. So if they lie down on their back, the Walmart greeters come over and they usher them out of the store. But if it looks as if they are on their knees getting a can from one of the lower shelves, that's fine. So there's a whole series of rituals around what it is to be amongst a vast array of choices of cereal in Walmart, and to be noticing that there is a lack of this encyclopedic sound wave brought through from nature.
Somatic
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very interesting. Yeah. Yes, and I do think, as we're talking about Zen, right? Sound is and silence is very important in Zen, and there's a certain, as far as I can speak to this, a certain intensification of sounds. I would say, right? If you're sitting for a while and the ringing of a bell or the wooden blocks, right? Whoa. Or the place where I often meditate, San Francisco Zen Center. It's in the center of the city, pretty much. A lot of traffic going around, and you hear a motorcycle or the engine revving or something like that. And, well, I guess part of the Zen practice would be to hear it just as the sound, and not even particular as a motorcycle anymore, but just paying attention to sounds, I think, is very important. Yeah. And of course, if you would all be quiet for a few seconds, right? And hear indeed electronic sounds mostly. Yeah, Tom.
It strikes me as interesting as somebody who also came of age in Seattle.
Yeah, and I
went to Nirvana concert before anyone knew who Nirvana was. What really strikes me in this invocation of Nirvana in this particular gathering is the name they gave to their band.
I know.
Yeah.
And I remember as a teenager, like, can you do that? They did do that, but I think it's telling somehow. I think it's some kind of interesting sideways clue that this band names itself Nirvana and becomes this phenomenon.
So-
What
Yeah.
aspiration, desire, convoluted imagining, or combination thereof does that name represent? That's a question I don't know how to answer, but it's one that occurs to me.
Well, I mean, one way to think about it is it was perhaps their refuge, right? Playing music. I mean, to me, so I grew up in Friesland, northern part of the Netherlands, and Tom has, his family, or your dad is originally from there, and his name is Pruiksma, which means wig
Wigmaker.
something like that.
Apparently, I'm doing the wrong thing.
So it is a very remote rural area, and as a teenager, that's not a place where you want to be if you're interested in culture and so forth. I don't know how I came into being, but I'm a weird contradiction in many ways. But my refuge was music, and I still remember the Walkman. I got one from a friend of mine, and I was playing tapes with music, and I was sitting in the bus, and I was so incredibly happy. And I'd never been that happy before as I can remember, because I was surrounded by all this stuff that I didn't want to be surrounded with, but I had my music, and it was my nirvana in a way, if I can use that term. But yeah, so yeah, I honestly have no idea why they call it nirvana, but that's an interesting question. Yeah.
You can weave nirvana into your streetless topic, because he did live underneath the bridge in Hoquiam, and you could still go down and stand where he stood when he was homeless as a teenager.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. Yeah, you see, I never really idolized him, so I didn't get into the details of his life, but that's really good to know, actually, yeah. Yeah, I can use that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Garrett?
Just real quick, not being sensitive or anything, but am I the only one in this room like really convinced he was probably murdered? Like he might not have taken his own life? I don't know. I almost like a conspiracy theorist.
But if you read the bench, you might find people agree with you.
Okay.
But
anyway, that's just me.
yeah.
Okay. I think a line from one of your poems yesterday, excuse me if I'm not quoting this right, but monotony in motion. I think that.
Metonymy.
Oh, metonymy. Okay, my bad. But anyway, yeah, I just resonated with it.
I might use that later.
My bad.
Put on the Buddha's grass shoes.
Collaboration.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Good. Well, thank you all.